Realism in American Literature, 1860 to 1890. Definitions. Broadly defined as the faithful representation of reality or verisimilitude, realism is a literary technique practiced by many schools of writing. Although strictly speaking, realism is a technique, it also denotes a particular kind of subject matter, especially the representation of middle-class life. A reaction against Romanticism, an interest in scientific method, the systematizing of the study of documentary history, and the influence of rational philosophy all affected the rise of realism. According to William Harman and Hugh Holman, where romanticists transcend the immediate to find the ideal and naturalists plumb the actual or superficial to find the scientific laws that control its actions, realists center their attention to a remarkable degree on the immediate, the here and now, the specific action, and the verifiable consequence. Many critics have suggested that there is no clear distinction between realism and its related late 19th century movement, naturalism. As Donald Pizer notes in his introduction to the Cambridge Companion to American Realism and Naturalism, Howells to London, the term realism is difficult to define, in part because it is used differently in European contexts than in American literature. Pizer suggests that whatever has been produced in fiction during the 1870s and 1880s that was new, interesting, and roughly similar in a number of ways can be designated as realism, and that an equally new, interesting, and roughly similar body of writing produced at the turn of the century can be designated as naturalism. But rather too simplistically, one rough distinction made by critics is that realism, espousing a deterministic philosophy and focusing on the lower classes, is considered naturalism. In American literature, the term realism encompasses the period of time from the Civil War to the turn of the century during which William Dean Howells, Rebecca Harding Davis, Henry James, Mark Twain, and others wrote fiction devoted to accurate representation and an exploration of American lives in various contexts. As the United States grew rapidly after the Civil War, the increasing rates of democracy and literacy, the rapid growth in industrialism and urbanization, an expanding population base due to immigration, and a relative rise in middle-class affluence provided a fertile literary environment for readers interested in understanding these rapid shifts in culture. In drawing attention to this connection, Amy Kaplan has called realism a strategy for imagining and managing the threats of social change. Realism was a movement that encompassed the entire country, or at least the Midwest and South, although many of the writers and critics associated with realism, notably W.D. Howells, were based in New England. Among the Midwestern writers considered realists would be Joseph Kirkland, E.W. Howe, and Hamlin Garland. The Southern writer John W. DeForest's Miss Ravenel's conversion from secession to loyalty is often considered a realist novel too. Characteristics. From Richard Chase, The American Novel and Its Tradition. The point formats are that it renders reality closely and in comprehensive detail, selective presentation of reality with an emphasis on verisimilitude, even at the expense of the well-made plot. Point. Character is more important than action and plot. Complex ethical choices are often the subject. Point. Characters appear in their real complexity of temperament and motive. They are in inexplicable relation to nature, to each other, to their social class, to their own pasts. Point. Class is important. The novel has traditionally served the interests and aspirations of an insurgent middle class. Point. Events will usually be plausible. Realistic novels avoid the sensational, dramatic elements of naturalistic novels and romances. Point. Diction is natural vernacular, not heightened or poetic. Tone may be comic, satiric, or matter of fact. Point. Objectivity in presentation becomes increasingly important. Overt, authorial comments or intrusions diminish on the century as the century progresses. Point. Interior or psychological realism, a variant form. Point. In Black and White Strangers, Kenneth Warren suggests that a basic difference between realism and sentimentalism is that in realism, the redemption of the individual lay within the social world. But in sentimental fiction, the redemption of the social world lay with the individual. The realism of James and Twain was critically acclaimed in 20th century. Howellsian realism fell into disfavor as part of early 20th century rebellion against the genteel tradition. Practitioners: Mark Twain, William Dean Howells, Rebecca Harding Davis, John W. DeForest, Joseph Kirkland, E. W. Howe, Hamlin Garland, Henry James. Other views of realism. The basic axiom of the realistic view of mortality was that there could be no moralizing in the novel. The morality of the realists then was built upon what appears a paradox: morality with an abhorrence of moralizing. Their ethical beliefs called, first of all, for a rejection of scheme of moral behavior imposed from without upon the characters of fiction and their actions. Yet, Howells always claimed for his works a deep moral purpose. What was it? It was based upon three propositions: that life, social life as lived in the world Howells knew, was valuable and was permeated with morality, that its continued health depended upon the use of human reason to overcome the anarchic selfishness of human passions, that an objective portrayal of human life by art will illustrate the superior value of civilized man, of human reason over animal passion and primitive ignorance. Everett Carter, Howells and the Age of Realism. Realism set itself at work to consider characters and events which are apparently the most ordinary and uninteresting, in order to extract from these their full value and true meaning. It would apprehend in all particulars the connection between the familiar and the extraordinary, and the seen and unseen of human nature. Beneath the deceptive cloak of outwardly eventful days, it detects and endeavors to trace the outlines of the spirits that are hidden there, though measure the changes in their growth, to watch the symptoms of moral decay or regeneration, to fathom their histories of passionate or intellectual problems. In short, realism reveals where we thought nothing worth of notice. It shows everything to be rife with significance. Realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material. This was a quote by Editor's Study. The quote before that was George Parsons Lathrop in The Novel and Its Future by Atlantic Monthly. Next quote is Realism and the art of depicting nature as it is seen by toads. The charm sufficing a landscape painted by a mole or a story written by a measuring worm. Quote by Ambrose Bierce in The Devil's Dictionary, 1911. Context and controversy. In its own time, realism was a subject of controversy. Debates over the suitability of realism as a mode of representation led to a critical exchange known as the Realism War. The realism of James and Twain was critically acclaimed in the 20th century. Howellsian realism fell into disfavor, however, as part of early 20th century rebellion against the genteel tradition. For an account of these and other issues, see the Realism bibliography and essays by Pizer, Michael Anisco, Richard Leon, and Louis J. Budd, among others, in the Cambridge Guide to Realism and Naturalism.